Okay, so remember, we're now going to talk about Western interaction with Japan. And so think about, how is their interaction or how does Japan react to Western imperialism? How's it similar to how their reaction with China? How is it different? And then circle back to thinking about the comparison to Africa and India. Okay, so just to remind you, when we last left Japan, right, they were isolationists, and they, except for maybe the Dutch, they had shut down their ports completely to Westerners. They had a strict feudal system, much like Europe did back in the day in the Middle Ages and longer. And it was a military government known as the Tokugawa shogunate. So they did have the emperor, right? But he was kind of off in Kyoto, kind of ignored. And then the shogun, almost like a military leader, was in charge. And the highest class here, of course, were the samurai. So, how does Japan then end their isolation? And what does this guy have to do with it? Huh? Anyone? Matthew Perry. I don't know if that joke is still good. Or Matthew Perry. So in 1853, we've got the United States out and about here, and we are the ones that force Japan to trade, or we use something called cannonball diplomacy, right? Matthew Perry says, trade or else, right? They come back with 4 ships with cannons on it. And suddenly the Japanese are like, fine. So they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, and Japan has to open up 2 cities, 2 port cities. But then, of course, it can't just be America, and by 1860, other countries follow. So what is the Japanese reaction? Well, much like we see throughout the world, right, you have the elite sort of rebel. And so the Tokugawa shogunate is no longer, and the emperor is restored to the throne, and this is known as the Meiji Restoration. So there's this great website, MIT Visualizing Cultures, and MIT kind of collected these art work kind of this initial encounter, and so I always think this is interesting. This is the Japanese depiction of the American steamships, right, that came with Admiral Perry. So Meiji then means enlightened, and so they restore the emperor Mutsuhito to the throne, and they start to use the West as an example. So they send out people throughout the West to kind of take it all in and see what they think is valuable. So they will centralize their government, much like Germany has. They will copy their public school system from the United States and their military from the British and the Germans, and they industrialize, right? And they go through a fairly rapid period of industrialization. So everything that we talked about in Europe, you see the same thing, right? The workers, the growth of the working class, exploitation, early unions, the whole 9 yards. And so look at these images here. Notice the Japanese patterns of cloth, but they are dressing now like a woman would in Paris or London. And you can see the men using the Western military uniform. So if they're going to be like the West and they've industrialized, they must also become imperialists. Yay! Or as the Koreans say, no. So Japan looks to exercise their imperial might, and unfortunately they look to their neighbors, Korea. And so China's like, whoa, 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 easy there. We kind of like to help slash, I don't know, mess with Korea ourselves. So that brings China and Japan into conflict, and they have the first of a few conflicts, I guess, the Sino-Japanese War. And so Japan is victorious and China has to retreat. And so, well, I should say, beginning in probably 1905 or thereabouts, Japan will slowly, or I guess I should say after the Sino-Japanese War, soon after that, especially in the early 20th century, Japan will slowly start to control Korea and then annex them, I think, by 1910. And they'll stay there until after Japan is defeated in World War II. So their dealings in Korea also brings them in contact with the Russians. And so they then fight the Russo-Japanese War, and it will have enormous implications. And I thought this was cool, again, from the MIT Visualizing Cultures. So we're up here, up in the north. So we've got the Russian Empire kind of moving out to this part of the world, and you can see all the conflict here. And so as the Russians are expanding and the Japanese are expanding, they start to come into a rivalry here. And so the war begins around here with in Port Arthur. And the Japanese make quick work of the Russians, and we'll see that will start a revolution in Russia and we'll come back to this, but it is clear not only to the Russian people, but a lot of Europeans that Russia is not as strong as they once were. What else I think is interesting here is because we see Japan flexing their industrial might, we start to see that the West at first was like, yay, Japan, we're best friends and we like each other. But once they defeat the Europeans, they're like, wait a minute. Remember, this is also the time of social Darwinism and European superiority. So this is going to scare them, right, when a non-European power can beat a European power. So these are just some pictures from this MIT Visualizing Cultures website. And so these are these huge shells waiting for Port Arthur. Here's a Shinto ceremony for the fallen soldiers. And then these Japanese block prints of the Russo-Japanese War. So you can see kind of this melding of traditional Japanese art, but you can see the warfare here is very much industrialized, and their uniforms are Western. And here some again fighting the Russians up north. So, oops. Anyway, in conclusion, Japan, I think, reacts a little bit differently, right, from our other areas, where they decide to, where I think other areas sort of struggle. What do they keep of their own culture? What should they take from the West? They just kind of go overboard and say, okay, if this is what it takes, this is what it takes. And then they become an industrial and imperial power.